Okay, so let's do a proper introduction. We're talking about wild problems this evening with the incredible Russ Roberts, who's written a very uneconomics book, although it's kind of based in a little bit of economics. It's kind of the opposite of all the criticism economists normally get about focusing on econs rather than on humans. This is very much more focused to actual humans solving the real problems that affect most of us in our day-to-day lives. And so I don't want to do too much talking this evening. I would like Russ to introduce himself and maybe encapsulate the idea behind what he tried to put down on the page for us this evening.
Hi, I'm Russ Roberts. I'm with you tonight from Jerusalem, Israel, where I'm the president of Shalom College, and it is 7:07 p.m. here in Israel. I wrote this book because I think there are certain problems that don't lend themselves to the standard tools of rationality. Standard tools of rationality being pros, cons, plus, minuses, cost-benefit analysis, the economist's calculus of adding up pleasure and subtracting pain. And underlying that idea is the idea that all pleasures and pains can be comparable to each other or made comparable to each other. And for many things, that's close enough to be true. But for the kind of problems that this book deals with, I suggest that that's a misleading way to think about decision-making. So the kind of problems that I write about in this book are the problems I call the decisions that define us. That would be decisions that we make a handful of times in our lives, most of those being decisions like whether to marry, whether to have children, how many children, what career to pursue, where to live. These are decisions that we don't have analytical techniques that are helpful to us. In fact, most of the analytical techniques we would normally use, data, algorithms, recipes, cost-benefit analysis, I think actually mislead us because we are prone to forget the important aspects of these decisions for who we are and who we might become.
Well, I'm going to start off by going completely off script, because although I actually said that the book is about personal problems, and most of the examples you've used in the book are very, very personal things about whether or not to get married, whether or not to move to a different country, whether or not to have children. But as I was reading the book, I thought, I work in the future space, and we talk a lot about wicked problems, which are actually social problems that also cannot be quantified and cannot be sort of boiled down to neat utilitarian or economic logic. And I almost think that that's something that perhaps is the most valuable part of your book coming out of this, that if we can't even solve problems absolutely for ourselves, what sort of hubris do we have as societies thinking that we can solve wicked problems at a societal level by using techniques that try and quantify really irreconcilable, the sum total of very irreconcilable personal views, values, ethics, and morals. It's hard enough to do it for ourselves. How is it possible that we think that we can use these tools at scale? Do you have a comment on that? Was that a very unfair question?
No, that's a great question. I don't write about it in the book explicitly, but I recently wrote a way too long essay at medium.com called Apples and Oranges, A Critique of Utilitarianism, where I do extend the analysis of the book from personal problems to the larger question of social problems. So each of us makes some kind, you could argue each of us makes a utilitarian calculus when we make any decision. Is this going to be good for me or bad for me? Are the benefits going to be bigger than the costs, in which case I might do it. If I think the costs are going to be bigger than the benefits, I'm not going to do it. I would argue, as I suggested a minute ago, that some of our problems, that's very hard to make this kind of that kind of calculus, that kind of comparison. An example, my mother is turning 90 in a few weeks, and I'm going to fly from Tel Aviv all the way to Memphis, Tennessee for a party to honor her. It's really a lot of hassle to fly to Memphis, Tennessee from Tel Aviv. It's a lot of hours. And am I doing it because I think the benefits outweigh the costs? I'm doing it because I think it's the right thing to do. And then you can say, well, but you think the right thing to do is what gives you pleasure. So you can cram everything into a utilitarian straitjacket if you want. But I think it's more useful in this setting to think of that decision that I'm making as one that it's not really about what gives me the most pleasure. It's about sometimes what I think I should do. Same would be true in my marriage. I don't always do what I want to do in my marriage. I don't treat my marriage as a question of what's in it for me, which is the economist mindset. It's a great mindset when you're shopping on the internet. It's a great mindset in many settings. It's not the right mindset for building a great family or a marriage or friendship, right? Now, if you have a friend who always takes advantage of, if there's nothing in it for you, you probably should maybe look for a different friend. But if you're always on every decision thinking, well, I'll let him pick up the check this time because he offered, why not? I know he's done it the last 4 times in a row, but this will be great for me. I got a 5th in a row. This is great. That's the wrong way to look at friendship. It's the wrong way to look at marriage. Economists like to say that people act as if they're doing that. Some do. They're not very nice people. Most of us understand that there are things more important than the day-to-day utilitarian things we're talking about here. Now, that's me as a person individually. How about socially comparing my happiness, unhappiness to your happiness and unhappiness, which probably is what your question was getting at. Economists do that all the time. I think some of it's pretty absurd, right?
Markets do it all the time.
Say it again.
Markets are supposed to do that, so we can find matches rather than impose them, which is the difference, I think, between.
Prices emerge from the market interaction of buyers and sellers, but that's different than the government saying, if we pass the minimum wage, a certain number of people are going to lose their jobs, but there's another group of people that are going to get higher pay. And we believe, whoever we is, there is no we, but there's an argument to be made that the gains to the winners outweigh the losses to the losers. And therefore, it's good for society. But it's bad.
It's not a win-win trade there at all.
It's not a win-win trade. Almost many public policy interventions like that have losers. So what the economists do in those situations is they say, well, but the gains are large enough so that the losers could be compensated, right? In the minimum wage, it's not necessarily true, but it's often, this kind of argument is often made. The gains are large enough. So when I look at society as a whole, so I take Bronwyn's gain is $53 and Russ's loss is 50. So we as a whole are better off by $3. And I think that's a very ethically problematic calculus. I think the right way to think about that is Bronwyn's $53 better off and Russ is $50 worse off. And that summarizes it. The urge we have to add them all up, the pluses and minuses, to get a single number to make a decision is what I find troubling. And that was your original question. But that doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean we should never do anything. It doesn't mean we can't ever know anything. But the real problem I have is the economist's insistence that we know exactly what the benefits are or exactly what the costs are.
It's solvable.
Exactly. And I think that's problematic. I'm much more comfortable saying some people win, some people lose, and you might have your view of that trade-off. I might have a different view. And what politics does is it tries to adjudicate the fact that we don't agree about this. It's a messy adjudication. Let's not pretend that political outcomes are, quote, the will of the people, which I don't agree with.
Yeah, well, at least you've got a chance to sort of vote in another sort of 4 or 5 years, depending on your election cycle there. What you were saying, I did find quite interesting. I'm sure many of you would have seen in the news over the last couple of weeks that we are trying to find prices and markets for things that we didn't have prices for, those more sort of softer things. So we finding ways that we could actually come up with a sort of market-related price for quite undefinable things, including like the height privilege question, which has come out after COVID, where we've had a whole bunch of men who are paying what turns out to be the market price for height privilege is around about $300,000 to get your legs broken and then stretched so that you can be taller than to sort of regain that sort of power and privilege in society. And I just bring that sort of case study up because it shows that we're constantly trying to price the unpriceable, right? We're trying to put numbers onto things that are very hard to do, because even though we've got a number for what men are prepared to pay to be taller, because that's the sort of market value there, we haven't even considered the pain and suffering element that goes with that, or the externalities. That's still a very personal choice. It's not even at a public scale. I do find it absolutely fascinating. So I'm glad we started this conversation with utilitarianism. But before I talk too much and derail this conversation too much to indulge my own questions and my own biases, I'd like to ask everyone else, if anyone has a question, please do raise your hand. It's supposed to be a discussion and not a performance. So we would really encourage you to take the questions you got in the comments and bring them so that everyone can listen to them. Do we have any volunteers, scapegoats, tributes? Anna.
Can I go first? Is it cheating?
Well, you got in first. You got to play fair.
I was first. Whilst reading the book, I never really thought about this, but now as we're discussing it, this came to me in light of all the effective altruist buzz going on. Whilst I was reading the book, Wild Problems, I meditated a lot on how do I measure my own happiness about something that only really, my future self's happiness in situations that my current self is completely unfamiliar with. Therefore, I don't know what will bring them pleasure or pain. There's the veil of ignorance, and those things will happen after. And I find that maybe the entirety of Gen Z is currently occupied with doing that, but on a collective level, trying to measure what everybody's future self will like in 200 years or not. Russ, do you see any overlaps here? Is there a scale problem where how we measure this for the individual is completely different for how we would measure it for a group? And do you think that it's like how much more difficult it is to decide for, say, there's the future of the self, and then the future of my family's happiness, and then my cities, et cetera, et cetera. How do the scales interact here?
Well, one of the themes of the book, which I learned from the philosopher L.A. Paul, is that when we make certain decisions in life, it changes who we are. And therefore, when we try to anticipate how we're going to feel about something in the future, we can't do that rationally because we're not going to be the same person. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that, oh, we grow and we change, which is true, but I'm talking about the actual decision here. So, for example, I think before you have children, you look at a minivan and you go, I don't want to drive one of those. And after you have children, you say, can I have a bigger one? Because I want my kid to be safe. Because having kids, and this whole experience is worth it just for your chat notes. I just want to say that. But having a child changes who you are. It doesn't just mean that you have a little creature running around that you have to take care of, which is true, you do. And that's the obvious downside. The obvious upside before you have kids is that, that first smile or their first steps or when they do well in school, or that's going to be fun. And my point of the book is that the fun of children and the not fun of children is really only a small piece of being a parent. Being a parent changes you. It changes the way you look at the world. It changes how you feel about things. You're literally a different person, and you're not prepared for that. You have very little way of anticipating that. And so that makes it hard to make what we would normally call a rational decision. Your question then is, well, what about for the world as a whole, right? When, we could take interesting way to think about this. I really like this question, because I think if you had told people in 1950 that there's going to be a device that people are going to look at all the time, and when they're on the, in a bus or walking down the street, they're just going to stare at it, and they would say, well, that's going to be hell. Now, there are some challenges of having an iPhone, a smartphone all the time, but most of us don't think it's hell. We think it's closer to heaven. We really like it. And when older people like me tell younger people, you're spending too much time on social media, it's degrading, and you're looking for dopamine fixes and getting all the excitement from the likes and your Facebook friends and comparing them to other people, and et cetera, et cetera. And the young people go like, you're old. You don't understand. You didn't grow up with this. So it's not that different. It's like a reverse version of the parenting thing, right? Your ability to understand. Let me take a different example, privacy. People my age, I'm 68, people my age look at the privacy habits of younger people and go like, oh, that's creepy, that's weird. How can they share all that stuff with, there's some obvious extreme examples, but even simple examples like letting websites go through your data and other things. Old people are like, oh, I don't like any of that. Young people are like, what are you talking about? Who cares? It's fine. Leave it alone. Don't worry about it. So there's a whole bunch of different cultural attitudes, obviously, about social media, about technology, for older people versus younger people, and they can't understand each other because they've had very different experiences in how they've grown up and what they've gone through and done. So it's a really interesting question. Like, young people are much more likely to say, maybe not a majority, but young people are much more likely to say, well, if the world has a bunch of robots and they're smarter than we are, and they extract our kidneys to make themselves more successful, that'll be the new humanity. They'll be called robots. Old people look at it, they go like, that's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. What are you talking about? Robots aren't conscious. They don't. But younger people are much more likely, not all, much more likely to be sympathetic to those kind of technological changes than older people, because they've grown up differently and have a different attitude toward technology, not because of education, life experiences. And so part of what the book's about, it's about none of this, by the way. We're just having a good time here. Part of what the book's about is how to think about the fact that your older self is not going to be the same as your younger self. And when you make decisions, instead of just trying to forecast how happy you're going to be, you should be worrying and thinking about, not worrying, because the book's trying to reduce worry. You should be thinking about, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to become? And how does this decision affect that? And it's a very different idea than saying, in my armchair, am I going to be happy as a parent, or happy living in Israel, or happy as a career as a lawyer? Or even a subtler example, if I commit to spending lots of time with my friends, and that comes at the expense of my career, am I going to be a happier person than if I have pure ambition, step all over my friends and get really rich and have lots of achievements? Those are two really different ways of going through the world. And my suggestion is that you think about that, because it's not the happiness alone that's day to day that's going to determine which is the so-called right decision.
Well, happiness is just one part of the value equation, right? Isn't that what you're encouraging readers to do, to figure out what they actually truly value? I mean, these questions derail into philosophy pretty quickly, but just on that point around parenting,
Not derail. Not derail. Get back on the track.
Sometimes that's a good thing, right? Sometimes you need to get off the train. Sometimes you need to have the crash. I mean, like I live in South Africa. We're on, at the moment, stage 4 load shedding, which is something you might all hopefully not have to experience as Europe goes into its energy crunch this winter. That's rolling blackouts, which we've had for sort of 20 years. But we've had them slowly. Like, it started off with stage 1, which was like 2 hours of power outage a day. And then it's like then we got used to that. Then it was like stage 4. And next year is going to look like stage 6, which is 12 hours of power blackouts a day. And it's like the sort of frog in the pot thing, right? So you can slowly make the wrong choices over a long time. Sometimes you do need to actually sort of let go of the old to get into the new. I know that strays quite close to accelerationism, which is a whole different conversation, but still sometimes you actually have to have a crisis in order to make a choice, which is, I think, a lot of people wait for that point, wait for the crisis rather than waiting or making a move earlier down that train, right? And that's what we tend to do with these personal choices. We leave the small choices to compound until you get to a kind of a crisis moment, because we haven't actually had that conversation with ourselves within our own head around what do we actually value, what do we want on this short time on our little third rock from the sun as we head towards inevitable death, right? What do we want to make do with the time we've still got here? This is a real core question.
This is such a cheery conversation. Yeah.
It depends on your personality, whether you find that exciting or depressing.
True.
We got so little time. Is that's either a challenge or it's something to get depressed about. That's also a choice, right? So it's not.
Well, there's a video I love called "The Days Are Long and the Years Are Short." It's by Gretchen Rubin. It's 2 minutes, minute 55, minute 59. If you don't have children and you watch it, I think you go like, oh, that's interesting. If you do have children, most people I know who have children watch it either choke up or actually cry when they see it. Because when you have kids and when a woman is pregnant, the friends say things like, the years go by so quickly.
Yeah.
The problem is that the days do not go by quickly. When people would say to me, the years go by so quickly, I always want to say, didn't feel like it at the time, right? When you're dealing with the diaper changes and all the other trauma and anxiety and getting hurt and running to the emergency room for stitches. The time didn't go by so quickly. It went really agonizingly slowly. But her point, which is exactly right, the days do go by slowly. It's the years that go by quickly. Each day, and all of a sudden, your child's a different creature. It's your daughter's grown up. Your son's a different kind of person, and the challenge of appreciating that, as opposed to just trying to get through it, is really part of the real challenge of parenthood. When you don't have, when you first have kids, and it can be agonizing. You can't sleep. Your kids won't sleep. Your kid's screaming. Your kid's hungry. Your kid's got colic. Your kid's whatever. Just like, I gotta get through this. And you realize at some point, which is what Gretchen Rubin's little 2 minutes is about, is that these are the good times, right? Not the colic and the throwing out, but many of the challenges of parenting that are frustrating are, when they're gone, you don't feel the same way as you did when they were in the middle of them. And that's true of a lot of things in life, right? And to appreciate the present, despite its challenges, is a tremendous gift. Not easy to do.
Absolutely not. Jonathan, we are going to get to you in a second. I'm just going to monopolize for us one more point, because one of I thought the most amusing but also sort of poignant examples in the book that relates to having children. I do have a child of my own. I have to confess, so it puts us on a certain point. I didn't want kids at the time, so I think that's also important to kind of put on the table. But the example you use from the rationalist community that came out of Tom Shiver's book, talking about the woman who totes around her robot baby that cries and pees and demands attention, I just thought so absolutely hilarious, because if you're using those sorts of very rational techniques to see if you want something or not, or if a partner is good for you or not, right? By trying to play with a chat bot that has all the characteristics that you want, you're only ever going to see the negative side of the equation, because there are practically no extrinsic benefits to having children, not in the modern world. They certainly guarantee of a retirement plan, as they used to be back in the day. But in terms of intrinsic benefits, that you will never get that from trying to replicate or simulate that sort of a relationship, because all the benefits for having a child are indescribable to anyone that doesn't have one, right? It's the sort of the pain and the care and most importantly, the connection that comes from building a connection with a fellow being doesn't actually have to love you back, right? That's the sort of the precarity of all human relationships that cannot be quantified. That's the sort of the risk of falling in love or having a child or any of that. On the other side, it's all intrinsic. It can't be simulated, which I thought was really, really interesting and quite funny. Yeah. It's a joke. Like you become irrational.
Yeah. The point of that is that the downside of children, I started to say this earlier, the downside of children is pretty clear. The upside is not what you think it is until you've gone through it. And the same, by the way, is true of marriage. I've been married 33 years, I think, more or less. And whenever I say that, it's greeted with wild applause. So, here we are in this virtual situation. But if we were all in the same room, you guys would have all like, well, that's so nice. 33 years, as like I'm a hero. I'm a survivor. It's like he's cancer-free for 26 years. He's married for 33 years. Wow, what an achievement. Let's hope not, right? It should be a delight. And some of it is, of course, most of it, I hope, much of it. But I think for many people, the benefits of a long marriage are unimaginable. And something special comes from sharing life experiences, the journey for a long time with one person. There are many advantages to not being married. We all understand what those are, most of us. It's the advantages of being married that are trickier to think about.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Okay, Jonathan, thank you for being so patient with us. Go ahead.
Pleasure. I have a prominent invited appreciations, and I have one wrapped in an observation that I hope is apropos. Russ, we've spent thousands of hours together in one way. It's a delight to have you in a two-direction. There was a time when I had every episode under my belt, but those are faded slightly.
Sorry.
No, just lots of other things going in life. Namely that I'm one of those people for whom divorce was unfortunately the only path to human flourishing. And your episode on how to become a vampire helped me wrestle seriously with that decision. So thank you, especially for that, and for the serious and compassionate way that you dealt with that in your book, recognizing that those are unfortunate realities. And the observation that I want to add to that, what Bronwyn was saying, that we make big decisions, but we also accumulate small ones. And when you make a choice isn't the only time that you're making a choice about who you want to become, that postponing a decision or living with the status quo or not bracing a new adventure that poses is just as much a becoming as pulling the trigger on something that you can't unpull. And so in that regard, as you mentioned, getting back on track to being a philosopher, most of us don't take our lives as seriously as we ought to any given day. And not making a decision can be just as bad as making the wrong one if you're getting used to not making decisions that need to be made.
Yeah, that's very well said, and thanks for the kind words. I think we have about 860 episodes of Econ Talk. In the early days, they're almost exactly an hour, but frequently now they're over an hour. So it's close to 1,000 hours, but maybe you've listened to some of them twice. She said thousands plural, and I really I deeply appreciate that.
Many of them, and then subsequent discussions with close friends, which they ignite and provide our intellectual fodder.
Oh, it's so kind. But I'm glad you brought up the point about divorce, because a lot of what I do in the book is try to make the case for children or marriage, things that I think are undervalued in our current culture. But I also try to make it clear that they're not for everyone. And of course, many marriages, the best choice is to end them. I try to not use the word mistake, which is the word we use as human beings. It's almost impossible to accurately describe a failed marriage as a mistake. You might regret it. You might wish you'd made a different decision, but a mistake implies that given the information you had, you made a bad decision. And I think I joke about it in the book. Alain de Botton, the philosopher and writer, has a wonderful talk called "You Are Going to Marry the Wrong Person." Well, that sounds depressing, but of course you are. There is someone better for you if you spent your whole life looking. And of course, sometimes you do marry the wrong person, a person who's not a good fit for you, who reduces your ability to flourish, or together you both flourish less than if you were single or married to someone else. And I write in the book about the challenge you have with one's identity in that situation. It's sometimes hard for people to accept that they made a mistake. Using that phrase, they think, "Oh, I made a mistake. I don't want anyone to know. I don't want to admit it. And if I get a divorce, I'm admitting it." And that's really a tragedy, because it's not a mistake. You're in the dark. Most of these decisions we're talking about are leaps into the darkness. You don't know how they're going to turn out. So how can that be a mistake if you don't know how it's going to turn out? A mistake is buying the same flavor of ice cream that you hate, right? But marrying someone you thought was going to be wonderful turns out not to be wonderful for you is not that surprising. It's really hard to do. And we know that's true. A lot of people end up divorced. So it's, part of the challenge, and it obviously goes well beyond marriage, and is part of the challenge is we put off decisions with the justification that we don't have enough data. And part of the theme of the book is you're never going to have enough data. So you're going to need a different method. And I was going to say one other thing, but I've totally forgotten it because it's 7:00 at night. So, but I thanks for the kind words. And I was going to say something about the vampire thing. So you're talking about an episode on Econ Talk where I interviewed the philosopher L.A. Paul, who uses the metaphor of a vampire for these kinds of decisions. If you look at vampires, they look disgusting. Most of them seem happy after they've become vampires. So now what? What if you make the leap? You can't come back. Very hard. Now, divorce, you can come back, but it's costly. In the case of vampires, it's a one-way decision. And some decisions are close to one-way decisions. They can be reversed, but only at a very high cost. And so her insight, which I think is a fantastic one, is that how do you think about that rationally, knowing that once you become a vampire, the idea of staying up late sleeping in a coffin and drinking human blood is a blast. And before you become one, it's disgusting. That's why I argue at one point in the book that you might want to use morality, not just pleasure or pain, to think about those decisions. I would like to argue that being a vampire is not nice. So maybe that's why you shouldn't be one, not because you're not going to like it. And that part of the book is about how ethics can help us and values can help us decide on some of these decisions. But the fundamental point you're making is that life's hard. We only go around once. We make a lot of these decisions when we're young. So of course, some of them don't work out. Try not to be so afraid of them. Take a chance.
And if I could add one other element, which is in the book, you overwhelmingly focus, I think appropriately, on who you are today and thinking seriously about who you'd like to be in the future. But I think it can also help to take serious and reasonably that who you were in the past is no longer who you are in the present. So that helped me make my decision, which was, I felt like it reflected really poorly on me if I were to say I'm a person that chose to get divorced. I took vows and then I broke them. And it helped me a lot to look past on, well, I'm 36 today, and I made those choices when I was 22, and I don't even need to call them a mistake, but also I can look back and go, this is going sufficiently poorly that we don't need to suffer the consequences that 22-year-old made me for the rest of my life, that I can tell the truth about it today. And that is hard, but I can look at my past self with kindness and say, you didn't know any better, and now you do. And now we can make different choices. And so looking both back and forward was useful to me.
That's a fantastic, really, really wonderful application of what I was trying to say, but I didn't say it in that setting. It's a really beautiful idea. You're a different person when you were 22, right? You're not that person anymore. You don't need to judge that person. You don't need to continue to be that person. You can say that person made a decision that doesn't work for me today, and therefore I don't want to be that person. The person I'm becoming, if I'm not careful, is the person I don't want to become. So I'm going to end that decision I made as a young person. I think that's a really beautiful idea. There's a related perspective from here in the present as I look to the future, and I think about who I might become. By doing that, whatever path I take, whether it's the aggressive, I'm going to leap, I'm going to change my career, I'm going to go learn how to play the flute, and I'm going to move to France. That decision, or the other one, which as you point out, is a decision. I'm going to stay where I am. I'm kind of happy. I think I'm fine. I'm not going to, or I'm afraid. I don't like. I'm worried. I'm scared of going to France. I'm scared of the flute. What if I fail? All those things that we have as we look into the future, that there's a temptation to say, but if I move to France, then I can't move to Germany. And if I move to France, I can't stay in my hometown. And there's a part of it's the fear of failure and then future regret that you'll look back on and say, I made a mistake. And you're liberating yourself from that by saying, I was a different person then. It's okay. And part of it is that you have to have regret. I learned this from Kiran Setia in this recent interview I did with him about his book, Midlife. Every choice we make in life closes other doors, whether it's to stay married or to get a divorce. Certain doors open, certain doors close. We have one life. The experiences that we're going to have are, he would argue, and I agree with him, it's very similar to what we talked about earlier, Brahman, they're incommensurate. If I choose to follow a certain path today and give up the opportunity to take a different path, if I'm not careful, I'll just say, oh, but then I'll miss out. You're always missing out. You're always going to have things that you can't do. And the beauty of being a human being, this is his insight, the beauty of a human being is that all those experiences are different. They're not commensurate. You can't say, okay, well, being in France is twice as good as being in Germany. So even though the flute won't turn out well, that'll make up. No, it won't. You gave up the chance to go to Germany. It's a different thing. But if you weren't a human being, you wouldn't care about that. A human being cares about that because they see each of us, we see the uniqueness of the path we take. And we can celebrate that instead of saying, oh, the road not taken. Oh, I missed that. I missed out on that. It's like every road is different. And if we weren't human beings, we wouldn't care. We just eat food or whatever animals do, right? Squirrel never says, I picked the wrong tree this winter. I'm in a mediocre tree. They don't care. They got acorns. They're fine. We don't feel that way. Every acorn, every meal is different, right? We have human company. It's cooked a certain way. Each journey is different. So we should try to celebrate. It's hard to do. I don't want to overstate the value of that. Anyway, that was a wild leap of imagination. I don't know if it worked, but I really appreciate it, Jonathan.
I mean, it's actually quite ironically quite close to classical economics and like sunk cost fallacy. You have to let go of what you have and just sort of work with what your current cards in your hand. You can only play those.
Yeah.
But even in terms of that idea of every choice we make sort of cuts us off from other choices, that's only half true, because every choice you make opens you up to new ones. It's like an evolutionary tree, right? The branch not taken withers and dies, but the new branch has new shoots that you would not get to unless you took that branch, right? So it's sort of like the great lottery of life. One of my favorite books from when I was a kid was the Solitaire Mystery, which everyone I've recommended to absolutely hates. But one of the ideas that came through on that book, it's by the same author that wrote this, the Solitaire Mystery, not Sophie's World, which I think everybody knows and lots of people liked. But there was a lot of philosophy in there, a lot of those ideas that relate to that whole lottery of life. Like we are the lucky winners as people that have managed to survive the evolutionary tree, but the same thing with our personal decisions, right? Like we are the total of those choices.
Yeah, I want to come back and try to apply that to Jonathan's example, because I don't think I did a very good job on that. I think maybe I can say it a little bit better. You know, I said, Jonathan, you did make a mistake because you couldn't have known how this was going to turn out. That's the vampire problem. And it didn't turn out the way you had hoped. So you've decided to go on a different path. The other point to think about, and it's very, I'm not sure it's a healthy way to think about it, but I think it's an interesting way to think about it, is that Jonathan is who he is today because of that decision he made when he was 22. And that branch grew, that 22-year-old branch. He could have stayed single. He got married, right? And that branch grew, and a whole bunch of experiences came to him because of that. And that's who you are today. You can't change that. You might wish it were otherwise, but you can't have it otherwise. And can you accept that who you are today in its full richness, which was full of pain, obviously, as some joy and delight, but lots of pain probably, and some suffering. But it made you the Jonathan that you are right this minute. And to embrace that, I don't know if that's a form of just false comfort, or is that the most essential thing we can do as human beings, is to realize that all the things that we have experienced have come today to this moment to make us who we are. I mean, a really crazy idea. Should I really go off on the crazy idea?
Please do.
So a really crazy idea would be, and I get this from it's from Ted Chiang's short story, The Story of Our Lives, which was made into Arrival. And then I listened to an analysis by Rabbi David Foreman. And I hope I'm being fair to all parties, not so much the movie, which is its own thing, but to Ted Chiang and to David Foreman's interpretation. Could you at 22, if I showed you the movie of what you were going to experience until you at this age, could you say, I'm going to go on that journey even though it doesn't turn out the way I might want it to go? And could you accept the ups and downs that come inevitably with any decision we make? And here's the key part, here's the trickiest part. The movie doesn't really capture your experience, because let's pretend it has no sound. And so even if it had sound and you see the emotion on your face and the people around you as you go through life with this prophecy, this ability to see the future, you don't know how you're going to feel. And how you feel in the face of those events is really what made you who you are today, not what happened. This is very hard for us to accept. I think as human beings, we think that what happens to us or what we choose, whether you believe in free will or not, but what happens to us and what we choose are what make us who we are. But of course, that's only the smallest part. The biggest part is how we process it, both in the real time as it happens and now looking back on it. And when I look ahead to my own, we can do this now. We look ahead to our own future. I'm 68. Bad things are going to happen to me. Right? They are. I'm going to get cancer probably. I could have heart problems. I could be dead tomorrow or in 10 years. It's likely that I think I'm the oldest person on this call. You're all likely to outlive me, right? So that sounded horrible, morbid, depressing, creepy, but it's not. It's life. It's it's no different than the fact that, I missed the bus today. And it's like, if I gotten out of bed thinking, oh, what if I missed the bus? And I did miss the bus. It's like, as you anticipate those things happening, the most important thing is how you process them. And I'm going to get cancer probably, almost certainly. I'm going to get old. I'm going to lose function of all kinds. And it's okay. That's the deal. It's all right. What were you going to say, Jonathan?
I was going to add an element to, I think especially when we're wrestling with different decisions, they expand to fill as much of our lives as we give them. And I know for myself, as I was wrestling with the idea of whether to get divorced, I was profoundly depressed. And so that's all I felt. And I could only imagine terrible consequences, right? Like if I do this, then I'm just tattooed with the scarlet letter. You're a guy that got divorced for the rest of my life. And I couldn't imagine a better outcome. And so I was just frozen for forever. And I drew a lot on Jordan Peterson, right? Like when you're in a tough situation and your life's not the way that you want, like start with making your bed. That's a thing that you can do. And as I started to order little pieces of my life, I began to be able to imagine, maybe once I got out of a terrible toxic marriage, I could find a better one. And maybe the negative things I learned about how terrible a relationship can be also taught me about how profoundly faithful I can be in the faith of that and how tremendous a better marriage might be. And I began to get really excited about that possibility. And so I think a lot of times just little momentum, right? Like don't let a dark decision expand to fill your entire life. I wound up, this is neither here nor there, but I would schedule it. I would wake up in the morning and I would meditate. And then for 15 minutes, I would completely feel how terrible I felt. And I would write it down and then I would put it away. And when that reared up at noon, I would go, no. We don't worry about the marriage until 8:45 tomorrow, but it's on the schedule. We're not going to forget to do it. And that was tremendously useful. But if you can get yourself out of being overwhelmed or depressed for a minute, you can imagine a better outcome. And similarly, I've heard you talk about people who think the world is going to hell for climate or whatever, and I wouldn't ever bring a child into it. Well, you can't imagine the glorious solutions that your children will invent. That might be the Einsteins that solve the thing for the entire planet. Like that may or may not be true, but it's absolutely a poverty-stricken perspective from which to imagine that solution. Anyway, I've monopolized that from my own personal life for far too long.
I did go back to something. Okay, carry on, Russ. And then I want to go back to something that Shahid put in the comments.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, in the comments, Shahid, you were talking about the lists, which was quite a big part of the book, right? I mean, like old Darwin putting all of his lists together, trying to see whether or not he should get married, and then discarding the list altogether and saying, to hell, I want a wife anyway, right? So he kind of knew what he wanted. The list was a kind of a procrastination technique. And you made a comment there saying that resorting to pros and cons or to trying to weight up a balance sheet when it comes to a personal decision shows a lack of awareness of self. Do you want to elaborate on that point maybe? Because I think it's kind of key to this. You have to know what you want in order to go get it.
Yeah, it's something that struck me just as I was sort of making my way through the book, and as I was reflecting on my own life. I think I realized that was the way I thought about a lot of big things, like whether to enter a partnership with someone, whether to sort of where to go, where to work, sort of things that I've thought about the past few years. And I think, I look at my friends around me who've made these choices with a pretty clear and confident mind, and they all have very strong senses of identity, I think, right? They have strong sense sort of who they are and who they want to be. And part of it just might be kind of being someone like me who's sort of, born a third culture kid and kind of moved around a bit, and sort of, I think that kind of jeopardizes that identity a little bit. But it's just, I don't have much more to add to that, but I think it's an interesting sort of perspective that people come from. Like, some people have very strong senses of who they want to be and who they are, and other people don't, and that just makes life difficult, I think, sometimes.
I think the other key part of that is our tolerance for risk and uncertainty. I argue in the book that we have a strong urge for certainty. I interviewed Robert Burton on Econ Talk. He's a remarkable thinker on this question, and we'll tell ourselves crazy stories to make sure that we're in control of our own narrative. And it's very hard for us to let go of those and to recognize that we have imperfect control, or we don't know how it's going to turn out. It's interesting, Jonathan's example of meditating for 15 minutes, those small steps. We really need a sense often of autonomy and agency. And if we don't have it, we're going to very much shrink back into the status quo. And so to make these kind of choices, to bring it back to your point, Shahid, and the way you phrased it, Bronwyn, the pro-con cost-benefit list can't capture everything, and recognizing that and then using that recognition to help you think about whether to leap or not leap maybe it's a sign of maturity. I think a lot of I think when you're younger, it's a lot harder, and I think it does vary by person. But at some point in your life, you get more comfortable with taking risks, and you have a better confidence in your own ability to make decisions and to make your way in the world. And I like to joke, if you're not sure what to do, read my book. But the truth is, not everybody wants to take advice from an old guy about how to run their life. They got to make their own darn mistakes, and then they'll know what to do. And they'll read the book when they're in their 50s or 60s and say, I wish I'd had this book when I was younger. And if they had, they wouldn't have listened to it, because that's a lot of sense that's it's hard to take that kind of advice. But I think the question of self-awareness is a very profound one in general. And I think so much of what we learn from experience and from contemplation, meditation, mindfulness, sometimes religion, sometimes psychotherapy, is to be self-aware. And it's very hard. When you think about it, it's shockingly difficult to notice what you're doing. Should be kind of obvious, shouldn't it? You're doing it. Is anyone living it more vividly than yourself? And yet you don't see it much of the time. You don't see what's pushing your buttons. You don't see it. And then you start to notice it in other people, right? You say, I know why he said that. He's got an insecurity about that kind of thing. He says those kind of things a lot. And that's because you gotten to know him, and you've lived with yourself for as long as you've been alive. And if you're not careful, you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing. So self-awareness is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, I think just going back to the list, I thought that there's perhaps another element too. On the one hand, I think a lot of people don't have self-awareness and haven't actually thought about what it is they want, what they value, and what their values are. But reading Darwin's list, and I don't want to sound too arrogant because I'm far from being Darwin and having his sort of intellect or place in the world. When I read it, I recognized someone struggling with a conflict between duty and desire, or to put it in a different way, somebody that is conflicted between their values and what they value. This was a man that desperately wanted to get married, but he was having trouble being able to reconcile it with his values. So another way to put it, I've forgotten the quote, but it's something that I've spoken about quite a lot on my shows and written about. It's one of the trickiest things in my personal philosophy in terms of the moral value of failing to execute upon your natural gifts and talents. In other words, failing to actualize how ambitious you could be. And on the other hand, the moral peril of trying to grab more than is your share in the world. So in other words, the complete moral catch-22 as to whether you should try harder and accumulate more and be more successful and work more and, go out and grab it, or whether that's actually the problem on the other side, right? So I don't know. I think that was an interesting one, like the conflict between values and what you value and how sometimes that is irreconcilable. And you've spoken about that too with the vampire thing, but sometimes those sort of moral distinctions are more subtle. Like he was dealing with the value of being a good person and the value of doing good work.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm not sure that's what he was struggling with, but a lot of times that is the struggle. Duty versus desire. It could be duty to family. It could be duty to one's own self and values. And I think that's a really, really nice way to summarize it. For those of you who haven't read the book, Darwin basically is trying to decide whether to get married, and he makes his list of the pros and the cons, and it's clear that the cons, there are more cons than pros, and the cons are more significant than the pros, and the pros are pretty thin. What?
Financially, professionally, all the quantifiable, rational choices were in the negative column. Yeah.
Yeah, and yet he gets married, and he can't, and he says so in his journal. We're looking at his journal notes. He says basically, to sit alone by myself in a dingy apartment. I've got to get married. Basically, he says, and I think in his case, marriage was something he aspired to, either because of his culture or his desire to become something more than he was. And he recognized that. It didn't make it into his pro-con list. He could have put it in, and I put it in there for him in a mock version. Those are really tough, it's hard to recognize those big overarching senses of self and identity sometimes that make us who we are. But he aspired to be something else, and he took a leap. About 6 months later, he married his cousin. Happily married, Anna, until maybe at the end.
Better in mind, the way he ended that list off, you can't help thinking that he already had he knew exactly who he was planning.
I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'm not a Darwinist scholar. I wonder if Darwin scholars have an answer to that question, if he had a plan. He doesn't use her name, certainly.
The great romance, the great Darwinian romance, right? I mean, that'd be a show bestseller for anyone who's watching this that wants to sit down and write.
Yeah, the excitement of what he called female chit-chat. It's really a horrifying pro-con list. That's not the worst one. The worst one is
I wonder what her list would be. That's the other question, right?
Oh, that's a great idea.
She didn't get to write a list. She
That is a great idea. Brian, can we write that together?
Yeah.
I think that would be spectacular. That's such a beautiful idea. I love it. Love it.
Okay, Anna, let's get to you.
Actually, it's just a quick note. I really, really love that part where, Russ, you're talking about how just having a list can actually help you find out what you want. Like, you have a list that clearly shows that you should not get married, and at the end you're like, to hell with it, I'm going to get married anyway. And I was thinking about this amazing, I think, best economics scene from the TV series Friends, when Rachel is pregnant and one of the other women tells her that it's negative, and she's like, oh. And that's how she finds out that she wants a child. Because up to that point, she's really worried that, what if I'm pregnant? And when she finds out that it's negative, she's really sad. And then the friend says, no, it's actually positive. And then she's like, yay, now I know what I want. And I think maybe this is why people take MBTI tests or go to the fortune teller. They just want to hear one version of the future and imagine that and kind of learn about their real preferences through that. So maybe we should encourage people to go to astrologers. And sorry, guys.
Oh, what a great idea.
I don't know.
Well, maybe
Spend your
the
money
writing
on this.
process helps us find out who we are, as opposed to it's something that's done by people that don't know who they are as a negative. Maybe it's a way that we get to know who we are by knowing where the list doesn't sit well with us. But then again, you still need enough self-awareness to act against the list, to do what Darwin did, which I think a lot of people end up doing the opposite. That's why a lot of us get married to the wrong people. We read the list and we were like, oh, on paper it looks good. I'm a fool not to be excited about this. We should go for it, right? Like, instead of following the inner intuition.
Well, I give the example of Kafka, who makes a very similar list to Darwin's and then decides, yeah, I'm not getting married, that's for sure. But Anna, your point, which I think is quite interesting, I have that example in the book of Piet Hein, the mathematician and scientist, who says his little poem. He says, when you can't decide what you want to do, flip a coin, and when it's in the air, you'll know what you really want. And that phrase, it's the same as the Friends example. That phrase, what you really want, seems to clash with our rationality, right? It says, instead of using the sober, calm, daylight, rational weighing of pluses and minuses, I'm going to go with my emotion. I'm going to go with what I really want. I'm going to, like, that whole idea of what you really want is really anathema, I think, to a thinking person, because it suggests that, coming back to our earlier conversation about self-awareness, is you're not self-aware. You don't know what you really want. Your list doesn't identify that. That's weird, right? That is not normal. That doesn't make any sense. And for a scientist to say, and I have many examples, I have 3 or 4 examples in the book, where a scientist will say, yeah, I had to redo the cost-benefit analysis because a quote wasn't coming out right. Well, what can that possibly mean? And what I argue, and I don't know if there's no right answer. I have no idea what the right answer is, but what I'm trying to argue there is that we do have a sense of something deeper and more profound than the mere day-to-day effects of our decisions. And I think that's what bothered Darwin. He understood it wasn't just about whether he was going to be happy or sad that his wife was sitting on the sofa waiting for him when he came home, that there was something else that was going to be going on there. And you read his autobiography, by the way, and he writes very beautifully about what his marriage was actually like and how it was meaningful to him. He writes very beautifully to her right before their wedding day. I think I quote that in the book, that that he appreciates her taking a chance on him. Right. You think about how interesting that is, right? She's going to have immortality that she would not otherwise have had by marrying the person who's going to turn out to be one of the greatest scientists of all time. But he's very grateful that she, a normal person, would take him.
Yeah, jump in just with a quick note on this. So I'd like to ask, is this the same as revealed preference? Is this a kind of revealed preference? Because if so, then to me, it does seem scientific. And the other question would be, if we assume that Kafka and Darwin really knew whether they wanted to get married or not, whatever the list ended up kind of summarizing, that means that we do actually have an intuitive understanding of who we will be in the future.
That's a deep question.
Is that the wrong reading?
I don't know. That's a really deep question. I don't know the answer to that. I had a philosopher friend of mine, when I was just telling him about the idea of the book, he had not read it. But I told him when I was working on it, he said, do you write about the fact that we don't have any control over our decisions? That they're just made for us. We may feel like we're making a decision, but there's a certain inevitability. This would go back to the lack of free will question, or whether we have it or not. That in some, I don't want to get, I don't think it's, I don't know how to talk about this thoughtfully, but sometimes we feel like things are preordained, that we don't have a choice, that this is just the way it's going to go. Or when we look back on it and just say, well, I kind of made the wrong decision, or I didn't know how it was going to turn out, but I just didn't feel like I had a choice, which is a weird thing for a human being to say. Of course, you always have a choice, but sometimes it feels like you don't have a choice, right? Like you're being swept along. So I don't think we have foreknowledge of the future. I don't think that when we make those kind of decisions that we're somehow secretly knowing what we really should do. But I do think it's possible. I don't know if it's true, but I do think it's possible that we can intuit certain things that we might have trouble putting into words. And that's a different phenomenon. So the fact that Darwin couldn't write down the emotional side of marriage or shared life doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't aware of it, even though he didn't write it down. I would certainly argue, I didn't think about this when I wrote the book, but when we write a pro-con list or we try to write a journal entry about how we feel, certainly the limits of language are part of the problem for making that experience powerful. My dad used to joke that God gave him the soul of a poet, but not the skill of a poet. That he felt things so strongly, but he couldn't put them into the words that he wanted that made him satisfied as a poet. And life is a huge part of life that captures. We can't put a lot of the things we feel into words. So when we think about I didn't think about this when I wrote the book, but a pro-con list is limited by language. And maybe when we talk about using our intuition, we're talking about not tapping into the irrational or the emotional, but the parts of ourselves that we can't verbalize and make and write down. And when we're young, it's a lot of it, right? If you think about journal entries when we're younger, right? And I remember I've gone back and read my journals when I was in college, and I was in a creative writing class. I had to keep a journal. It's horrifying, of course, right? It's absolutely horrifying. It's full of embarrassing emotional statements that cringe. Say they're cringeworthy, that we need a different word. Cringeworthy doesn't cover it. And part of it is you're just bursting with feeling, and you don't have an outlet for it as a writer, and you don't have an outlet for it as a human being to connect with other people because you're emotionally immature by definition. You're young, right? And I think that's an aspect of this process I hadn't thought about in writing the book.
I think Nikki has a great point in the comments. It's also a technique we use with like corporate foresight work and like the professional sort of programs you'll do at management school and in business school, which is very different from like the economics and humanities people that normally talk on these calls. But the idea of kind of backcasting is this whole idea of, if you don't know what you want, kind of start with what you don't want. And you can kind of work backwards from there. At least that it limits some of the bad choices that you could make now if you could sort of follow those decision trees down, which is often much easier than starting with really the infinite future you have ahead of yourself. Because even if you are limiting yourself by making a B choice today, that branches out into millions of unanswerable questions very, very quickly just by using the sort of law of large numbers. So that whole idea of limiting your decision set to according to what you don't want, I think is also quite a powerful thinking tool. It's definitely one that we use in our work. Nikki, do you want to elaborate on that thoughts at all? Because I'm sure there's more that went behind that before we get on to the next pictures.
Sure. So, I mean, when I wrote that, I was thinking of many things, not really anything in specific, but it really applies to many things I've done, like between choosing what university degree to do, or like, I don't know, even like maybe buying a product, for example. I could care about turtles, and this brand producing one product abuses turtles, for a really shitty example. But like, I think a strong sense of like knowing what you're against, or like what you might not want to happen, so helps me reduce like the number of things I need to decide between. I don't really have.
It's a great starting point. I do think that's a good thing.
I want to comment on Jonathan's comment in the comments where he talks about your body knowing things. It's a very in meditation, you're told to listen to your body. Where do you feel the pain? Where do you feel the stress? Where do you feel the anxiety? And it's a very interesting, I think, useful exercise. But it reminds me of I'm going to elevate the pretentiousness of the salon. Is that okay, Anna? I'm going to quote Pascal.
Do it.
So there's a quote from Pascal, which I'm surprised I didn't put in the book. I'm pretty sure I didn't. Here's the quote: "The heart has its reasons that reason does not know." Now, I don't know if that's an accurate translation of Pascal didn't write in English, and he may have said something slightly different. And translation is a whole another challenge. But when we think about the heart or the body, in Jonathan's example, we tend to look down on it because it's not rational, it's not the mind, it's not reason. We're at its work, doing its work. And it's an interesting question of whether our body knows things that we don't know. Our body, forget the heart, which is a complicated organ. We tend to think of it as emotion, but it doesn't. You could argue it's a fuller rational picture when you include the heart, because it might include interactions with other people that are maybe not front of mind. But the idea that your body could tell you things that you don't know rationally, and this is Jonathan's point, which I think is a great point. Hunger is a pretty clear one. That's a good one, right? We don't rely on our brain to when we need to eat or drink. We listen to our body, ideally. Sometimes we listen to our head, but I think it's just a really interesting question. I don't know how to think about it, but it's an interesting question.
Well,
That Pascal quote.
To what Anna was saying about revealed preferences, right?
Oh, yeah, I didn't come back to that.
There's a gray space kind of in between the list and the decision and the action. The revealed preference is the actual action you take. If you had written the list, said, "Oh, I definitely want to get married. I love her so much. Mary's great," and then did nothing about it, his revealed preference would be actually not to get married, right? So in that very sort of literal sense, it's the actions that reveal what we do. And quite often we make decisions and we're like, "I'm definitely not doing that. I'm definitely not going to date that person. I'm definitely not going to say that in the meeting," but you do it anyway. Like, that's your revealed preference. We do this all the time. Yeah. I mean, maybe you have more self-control than I do, but my decisions, my revealed actions are not always exactly the same.
Yeah, it's a great example.
I think the no's are clear. I think where the body knows the answer idea rings really true to me, is that I think the no is very, very clear. Like, if you look at a food and you don't like it, you know it. Maybe you will try to please your mother-in-law and convince yourself that you will eat it, but you will not. I think it's the yes.
You got the soju.
The yes is complicated. But I just wanted to share one piece of a small fact that I think about a lot. I have a friend, Adam Kepec. He's also a Hungarian person. He's in the US. He's a scientist researching decision-making. And within decision-making, certainty, like confidence in decision in animals. And both he and other Hungarian neuroscientists that I know who study decision-making kind of seem to agree that animal decision-making is perfect. Like, yes, sometimes they electrocute themselves, et cetera, because they can't count on the second order consequences. But from their vantage point, within a split second, animal decision-making is almost perfect. Like, we've had millions and millions and millions of years to like make everything else die out, except the ones who can make perfect decisions for survival. And so if we say that we're animals, then we also have a perfect decision-making layer somewhere. And I'm sensing that maybe this is what we're talking about with the body having the wisdom, which really, really resonates to me. So I don't know how meditation helps with that. Often just looking at a person helps, or a food, or a photo of a city to decide, but yeah.
Yeah, that good old disgust like trigger. It's there for a reason, right? Got to trust the emotions. Jonathan, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to sort of suggest, we've got a lot of everyday decisions that we use cost benefits on, and our personal morality doesn't really enter into them. And we've got the decisions that define us. And I don't know if I want to make this universal, but for myself, I sort of want to define an in-between tier. The sort of thing where a cost benefit doesn't really help, and a pros and cons, and it maybe it involves who you might become and something, worth wrestling seriously. But also I want to take serious, like, I can reasonably expect to live into my 80s. I'm very prosperous. I live in the United States of America. And so there's a whole realm of things where I could just try it and learn by doing it. And if it's a colossal failure, it's unlikely to define my life for the worst. So if I can imagine moving to Berlin and finding out something serious, like maybe I should just do that. And if it doesn't work out and I commit to 6 months and I move back, like you might not even remember that 50 years from now. And so that's an opportunity probably not open to Darwin, right? Like that's a ship voyage that you might not make it there and probably wouldn't make it back and couldn't afford to do it twice. But we all have access to so many resources that I wouldn't try that with marriage or having children or divorce. Don't just try it. Oh, that didn't work. Let me undo it. But like trying a graduate degree, switching careers, moving around the world, all of those are things that you could plausibly pull off and learn in the process of doing and take seriously who you're becoming and just be less afraid of the downstream consequences, because there are so few truly fatal or life-altering consequences for us.
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. It's interesting. I have a chapter on optionality and the virtue of trying lots of things where the costs of changing the decision is relatively low. By the way, I wouldn't suggest that you would forget it 50 years from now. I think it actually would, even though you decided to move back from Berlin, it would actually have a impact on your life. Maybe my first thought is it'll be a good one. You experienced something different. You saw a different culture, even though you didn't want to live there and maybe be part of it. It will have enriched your life in certain ways. But some people who read the book when it was in draft form said that chapter was inconsistent with the rest of the book, because the rest of the book is about like being a vampire. You can't go back. But I think what you're saying is exactly right. There are many decisions that look hard, where you don't know whether it's going to be good or bad. You don't have any analytical way to anticipate whether it's going to be a good choice for you. So if the downside's low, take a chance, right? Relatively easy. And I think you could argue, I don't know if it's true, but you could argue that if you do enough of that, you'll get better at making mistakes, or what people call mistakes, and they'll bother you less. It's a little bit like, Jonathan, you as a longtime Econ Talk listener, I like to learn how to say, I don't know. The first time you say, I don't know, when you're trying to impress some people and they ask you something and you really don't know, instead of faking it or trying to, hide, you say, I don't know. I don't know about you, but that used to hurt me a lot. That was really hard for me to say, because a big part of my identity is knowing things. Why that's true is a whole other interesting thing. It's so embarrassing, and we'll leave it out of this salon. But the second time you say I don't know is a little easier. The 50th time, it's like water off a duck's back. I get pleasure from it now, because I know it makes other people uncomfortable to say it sometimes. And so I feel like, oh, I don't know. It's okay, really. It's okay. Try it. And so if you make a lot of those decisions when you're younger about where to live and what career, like dropping out of graduate school, I mean, that's a divorce, right? And for me, I had a similar experience. I dropped out of academic life for a while. I did something. I was an administrator in a business school. I ran a center. I wasn't doing so-called regular research. That was very hard for me. That was very hard for my identity. But having done that, it made me easier to take other chances later in my life. So, it's an interesting question. We raise our children, whether we should counsel them in how to make mistakes. Silicon Valley is famous for the value of mistakes. People who make mistakes get honored, supposedly. Like they're battle scarred. They've made their mistakes, and now they're ready for a successful company. Of course, those are the ones you hear about. There's a bunch who make a bunch of mistakes and never get over it, and that's life. But I do think that the culture of tolerating mistakes, so-called mistakes, again, I don't like that term, but things that didn't turn out the way you'd hoped. We need a phrase for that other than mistake.
And there's a lot of becoming in that process, right? So Russ, when you're a person that knows a lot of things and you're right all the time, people attribute you a lot of status, but it's a shell, because the first time that you're confidently wrong, it collapses and you're an idiot. So the first time you say, I don't know, is a vulnerability, but you're actually creating a place of strength. And the guy that confidently goes, That's an interesting question. I don't know. He has dramatically more status than Tyler Cowen, who knows everything about everything.
That's what we think in society, but that's not actually how it plays out, because there's quite confident research that says the people who are confidently wrong get more status and more acclaim and have more power over society, particularly in economics and politics, than those who accurately say, I don't know, who, or even worse, than those who are unconfidently right.
Well,
We reward people being confidently wrong, or just being confident in general.
This is Adam Smith's point about being loved and lovely. Adam Smith said, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And what he meant by that was we want attention and praise and respect and honor, and we want to earn it honestly. That's what that sentence means.
That was in the book.
And he says, yeah, a little brief part. Yeah. And then he said, so I forgot.
It was.
You've read my book. You've read my book more recently than I have. But then he says there's two ways to be loved. There's two ways to be respected and honored and praised. One way is to pursue fame, wealth, and power, and the other is to be honest, to be virtuous and wise. And he calls one of those the glittering path that seduces us and draws us. The other path is the little quieter thing where not as many people are going to pay attention to you. So I think Jonathan's point is that when you say, I don't know, among a small group, you earn their respect. When you say it in a big group, they go, oh, he's a nobody. I don't want to listen to him. So it's an interesting, I think it's a micro macro distinction there that's actually is not unimportant. When we play in the bigger sandbox, I've joked about this. A reporter will call me and say, the dollar went down today. What's your explanation? I'll say, I don't know. And I'll say, you don't know. Why would I talk to you? I said, well, because I'm telling you the truth. Those other people who tell you that they do know, they're liars or fools. That doesn't excite the journalist. It's too bad. But in a small group, it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose that's just a general human failing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you brought up my favorite quote there, Shahid. I've been quoting it nonstop on Twitter for like the last few weeks. That's Oscar Wilde. Everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. And I was going to bring that up tonight too, because almost all the examples that you used in your book over personal choices were about essentially questions of sex, reproduction, and marriage, which used to be like a license for some of those other activities, even as an end in and of itself, or as a means to an end. And a lot of our, or essentially all of our choices as a species do come down to the birds and bees of life, right? This is how society progresses, one generation and one funeral at a time, right? So
I gave my
out on that, since it's come up with at least two people's heads today.
Which? Do I have any thought on which?
on that, like in terms of the importance of those questions around sex, is in terms of like marriage and babies as being actually what drives most of us. I think that's what we're kind of getting to. Like a lot of the conversation today has been about what do we value as people? What do we value? What should we value as society? And I think, having thought about this myself, I think that generally what most of us are looking for, and again, the Darwin quote table thing reinforces this, is for, in one degree or another, most of us are driven by some sort of sense of achieving immortality, whether that is through, as I've tried to loosely say it, which oversimplifies the problem far too much, deed, seed, or creed, right? So you can leave a legacy like Darwin wanted to do, doing good work. You can make babies and live on in your genetic line, or through some sort of post-life immortality. That's through religion, which is why we would be guided by our values in that sense. So I don't know, does that oversimplify the problem of what we want too much? Or do you have any comments to add there, since we are straying into philosophy?
Oh, I love that. Well, my first thought is I obviously gave my book the wrong title. I should have called it Wild Sex. I would have sold a lot more copies.
But it's all about sex. It's a very sexy book.
Oh yeah. It's full
when
of,
you actually think about it.
It's a racy romp through human nature.
It is.
Sorry,
And
I have
by
to add
saying-
that if we change the
It's all
title
about
but
hooking
kept
up.
the subtitle, A Guide to the Decisions That Define Us, that would be very confusing.
But to take your comment seriously, Bron, which I think I should. Well, I'm going to come back. I'm going to tie it into Anna's point that animals don't make mistakes. Now, I don't know if that's true. I like to I like to look at birds, and sometimes when I'm watching a bird, I'm wondering what's going through their mind. And the answer, of course, is not much. but they do make decisions. They decide whatever that means. They fly here instead of there. They eat and take a chance on a crow eats some roadkill and risks getting killed themselves. But we are animals, as you pointed out. I think it was Anna. And now Bronwyn points out, and we're animals that are kind of powerfully driven by reproduction and leaving a legacy of seed or deed. And you could argue that's really what Darwin's list is about. That's fascinating. And of course, we put clothes on, right? We mask and cover our animal selves, more or less, and fool ourselves perhaps into thinking that we have a more rational basis for our decisions. When in fact, maybe a lot of it's driven by more primitive desires that we are not always aware of. It's very possible. Very possible.
But also,
Yeah,
sorry, if I could add a point, like I've noticed in the last several years that people around me who perhaps a decade ago just thought the world was getting better and it was going to keep doing that for a long time. And with Trump and Ukraine and everything else, there's this despair because there's so much you don't have control over. But the people that are healthy are the ones that made their world smaller and said, this is the sphere over which I have interfaced. And like, it's not on Facebook. So I don't go to Facebook to find it, but there's a lot of wealth there. And this is the sphere where there isn't a market because there isn't a price. And so a choice for integrity is literally defining the reality you live in, if this is your reality. Not so much if this is your reality, but you don't have control over that. And so I think a lot about the people that make choices for families, for integrity, for values that if you put a price on them would be infinite, but more importantly, it's simply a choice on, do I want to live in a world that I enjoy or one that I despise? And when your world is small enough, you have a tremendous amount of influence over exactly what that looks like and the people that you allow into it.
Well, I think about it a little bit differently, but I think it's a similar point. I don't really understand Marxism, but I'm going to pretend to for a minute. I'm not really an economist, but I play one on the internet. Marxism is a lot of it is about the loss of autonomy, right? It suggests that we are victims of larger economic forces that we cannot control, whether it's capital or whether it's our status as in the proletariat, bureaucrats. And of course, he's not totally wrong, right? There are many things that control us. That you mentioned earlier in the United States. If you're in Ukraine right now, your scope of autonomy is greatly limited, or if you're in Russia, or lots of other places. So one way to cope with that is to not to aim large, but to aim small, and to say, I am going to limit what I care about to the things where I have some autonomy. And I've often argued, and I still believe this deeply, that politics is an unhealthy place to get your sense of self and satisfaction, because you will inevitably be greatly disappointed. And it's not because Marx was right. It's not because the forces of the world are arrayed against you, the little person, but because these kind of problems are so complex, and the attempt, there's a certain naivete in the Marxist view that just says, well, if we all understood and agreed as to what the right thing to do is, we could get there from here. And of course, it's infinitely more complicated than that. That doesn't mean you should give up, doesn't mean you shouldn't try to make the world a better place. But again, I think it's more, where do you get your deepest satisfactions from? Where are your aspirations? So to aspire to be a good parent, to aspire to be a good friend, to aspire to be a good colleague, seems to be one could argue, is to aim quite low, right? Is to settle. And yet we know how hard those things are. And to achieve those is an extraordinary accomplishment. I don't have it here. I'm looking around my library, but I can find it almost instantly as we talk. I think I can find it without delaying. In the book Middlemarch by George Eliot, there's a ending, which is, thought I'd find it very quickly. Here we go. I think this will work.
I've got a copy.
Yes, I've got it. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. That's a really beautiful way of saying what I'm trying to say, which is that she says half, by the way. She doesn't say all. She doesn't say that politics is a waste of time. It's not. But she's saying much of what makes the world a better place is not from activism. It's from human decency employed with the people around us. And I believe that very deeply. Tending
your own garden first, right?
Yeah, correct.
But that's often harder to do. It's often harder to live a good, simple life than it is.
No kidding.
Especially if you're smart. If you're like reasonably smart and did okay in school, it's actually quite easy to be quite successful, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to maintain a relationship and to raise good kids and to be nice to your mom and dad, even when they phone you and annoy you, right? Like, and many comedians have spoken to this simple truth.
My dad said it. My dad liked to quote, I'm sure he didn't say it first, it's easy to love humanity. It's a lot easier to love humanity than human beings, right? I have grand aspirations toward people.
Why change me? Anna.
Thanks. I have a question, but I realized that there are people in the room sharing their ideas in the chat who might want to grab the mic from me. Jennifer, other Jonathan, Alexander, if you want to jump in, if you have any questions, points to share, we are here to listen and consider your ideas. No, you're good? Okay. Well, what I'm going to say.
I'm good for now, thanks.
Anyway, sorry?
I'm good for now, thanks.
You're good now, okay. One of the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my life was with my best friend. We were 27. We were still in Budapest both. This was before we would emigrate and go on our separate journeys. And probably two very interesting things happened to all the women at 27 that I did not see coming. I didn't know that that was some kind of an important cutoff line for a lot of things. My best friend, unlike me, eminent students, did 2 master's degrees at 2 different universities in parallel. Was much more, coming from my dream version, from the outside dream version of the middle class success, doctor parents, A+, success in sports, etc., etc. And I remember at 27, she stopped and she was like, they lied to us. This is not the key. And I remember standing there with like the bikes, and I remember the whole situation. And I come from this completely messed up Eastern European show business family. My parents always working on like 10 TV series in parallel so that one succeeds. And there was always this kind of manic abundance to how they thought about the future. And I remember just confronting these 2 mental models that we had taken for granted and never verbalized or questioned until that point. And I remember her eyes, and this is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life, realizing that you can actually do anything. And I think that the real, and I do believe in free will, and I think the reason why we're having this conversation is because at some point, all of us here had to realize that the rules of the game don't exist because we tried in one way or another, we did the right thing. And in most cases, either didn't get the reward that was kind of subliminally promised because it's never explicit because they kind of like withhold the optionality, or we got what we wanted and it was terrible. And you're like, oh, I'm in this marriage, I'm in this university, I'm in this city, and it's supposed to be amazing. Why do I hate it? And then you realize that actually everybody hates it, but everybody else thinks that everybody else is having a great time. This is London. Like, I'm sorry for people in love with London. It's like you're there and you realize that everybody is unhappy, but everybody thinks that everybody else is happy. It's horrible. And then you're like, I can just leave. I left London literally, the whole decision took me 2 days. After 7 years, I packed up, got on a Eurostar and got out. And it literally solved 90% of my problems in life just to leave that city. And there's this moment, and I think, but with that moment comes the horror of the list that doesn't tell you that, okay, then if there are no rules, then you're the compass. And so I really, I don't know how much this would resonate with people here, but we are our own sheet music. This is how I would put it. But I know, Russ, that you prefer the poetry analogies. Jennifer, a lot? In what way?
Oh yeah, it's resonating for me a lot in every way. Everything that you're saying. I think I identify a lot with your friend as someone who followed the rules and I guess formed certain expectations, and then when those expectations were either met or not met in different ways, in whatever way, had a sort of crisis of identity, and some sort. I want to use the word existential crisis. Yeah.
I think those are beautiful examples of what we've been dancing around through this whole conversation. First of all, it involves some self-awareness that much of what you've been doing has been driven by what you perceive to be the rules that came typically from your parents, but from your circle of friends and your culture writ large. And the unwritten rule, the especially important unwritten rule that I think that both Anna's friend and Jennifer are talking about is that if you do these things, you will be happy. And that doesn't follow, of course. And I think I've never thought about this, but I think it's a little bit of what economists call an externality, and that as parents, we love our children, but we also care about what other people think about our children. And because we're constantly talking about our children, we want to be able to say certain things. It's like the holiday card that shows all the kids are beautifully dressed and they're all in the list, and on the back of the card, is all the things the kids have achieved over the last year, and you want to vomit because your kids will never live up to that, right? And you're thinking, who would send out such a card? And yet I think a lot of people send out that card either literally.
They were those people.
Who are
parents? They still do.
Oh, yeah. And
no one asked the children, by the way.
What?
No one asked the children either, by the way.
No, of course not. No.
Yes.
But think about that. That's a strange thing. And so we push our children, we hope for their own good, but maybe for our good sometimes, with these certain rules about success. That's the way I would think about it. I mentioned earlier Kiran Setia in his book Midlife. One of the distinctions he makes in there that's so fantastic is between what he calls telic and atelic activity. Telic meaning goal-oriented, atelic meaning not goal-oriented. Telic meaning projects like get a degree, publish a paper, get the promotion, make vice president. All those things are telic. And we get on the treadmill and we assume that when we achieve the goal, we're going to be happy. And it doesn't always work. So now what? And the idea that you can step back and say, I do have free will, or at least the illusion of it, which is just as good. It's like, it's like the Fermi joke where the student comes into Fermi's office and sees a horseshoe and says, Professor Fermi, you don't believe in that, do you? He said, of course not. But they say it works even if you don't believe in it. And that's sometimes I think that way about free will. So you do have free will. You can quit your job. You can leave London. You can get off the treadmill. You can get off. It's not the treadmill. That's what's interesting about it. It's not a treadmill. It's actually going places. It's an escalator. It's shooting up into the upper regions of the building. But you're not happy. Not only you're not happy, you've lost that sense of autonomy and self, because at some point you sometimes realize, and this is not me speaking about my own life. I haven't thought about this for my own life. Maybe it is. But in general, I think for many people, it's like you wake up one day and you realize, I'm not doing what I want to do, period. Nothing fancy about it. I'm not doing what I want to do. And when you realize that you can do what you want to do, the world opens up. All right. It's an unbelievable thing. Now, for others, I guess I assume for some people that it's helpful to have a bunch of rules, because we were talking earlier, it's scary to think you can do what you want to do. All right. So.
And it's what, Bronwyn, you mentioned about crises. Andrew Feldmar, the Hungarian psychologist, uses this example of the child being born, that for a child's perspective, they don't have any information about the outside world. All they know is that they are inside, there's warm water, they get food, and they have no idea what's outside. And Feldmar uses this example of it having to become so unbearably tight and uncomfortable in the womb that for the child, anything, whatever is outside, can only be better. And this is what I thought of when Bronwyn, you mentioned this, like most people push it to, like T.S. Eliot, you push it to the crisis where so that it can feel inevitable, so you don't have to deal with the burden of having to decide and then maybe regret it later. But I think for those of us who may have had like violent experiences or like really humiliating experiences, there's also this other kind of identity annihilation danger that I think in a small version we actually live in much less dangerous situations, that if I let this happen, then I either disappear or I will not have any kind of moral claim over myself after that. And I think the destruction of a desired identity in the future, or fearing that, is a really interesting kind of mini crisis that we navigate. I mean, I just raised, money for my company, and it was really important that I wanted to have specific investors in my company, because even my company has an identity. Its identity is that these specific people with these specific values are investing in the company as opposed to everybody else.
I think that sort of ties in with what Jonathan Stewart put in the comments. He put the quote there that says, we're the only constants in our own life. It's like we have to figure out how to live with ourselves, if nothing else, right? That's one way to look at choices, isn't it? Will I be able to live with myself making this further down the line?
Yeah.
I think that's really important. I think for a lot of people, a bunch of moral decisions boil down to, would I be able to look into the mirror tomorrow if I did this? And
it's a good values check.
Yeah, and a decision may seem extremely rational, and maybe all your friends are telling you to do X, Y, Z, or you're being pressured other ways. But for you, that's just not somebody that you would be comfortable with. I tend to say that we greatly overestimate the awesome problem solving and forgiveness qualities of our future selves. So we're like, I would just do this super dumb thing to somebody today, and my future self will figure it out. We'll forgive herself this. I can't, but she will, 5 days from now, I will be much wiser. Or we'll just have amazing like resolution talents and we'll deal with this. Yeah. Don't give yourself bad memories on purpose is a good motto to live by.
That's one way to put it. Although I suppose it can also go a bit the other way, that if you start thinking like that, you can end up with the choice paralysis, which I think is one of the sort of subtext of this conversation. The point is that before you start drawing up pros and cons lists or reading books like this one, you are a person that's actually still believes that you have choices to make and has some sort of degree of belief, however small it is, in, free will. So, and I think as you were mentioning there, Russ, like a lot of people seem to be giving up on that. And free will is one of those things that, whether it's imaginary or not, if you don't use it, you don't have it, right? You have to actually exercise a choice in order to make a choice. And you see this in politics, you see this in economics, you see this in the workplace, even with like younger staff members. Like, just if I don't make the choice, someone else will make it for me. And they're sort of not even interested in engaging with ideas like this. So I think that's a separate challenge, probably not relevant to the people in this virtual room right now, but that question of actually using your agency and making choices and feeling empowered enough to make them. So I don't think it's a case of apathy. I think it's more a case of defeat in the face of a world that seems too powerful. It seems like Marx was right, like you were alluding to earlier. If you actually buy that ideology, if you buy into the degrowth movement or whatever, those expectations become your reality. And yes, it's very Ecclesiastes, isn't it? There's no point in making choices if it's all for naught anyway. I think that's maybe that's a topic for another book. Maybe you can write that book.
Neil Stephenson has this amazing, I think it's in Cryptonomicon, there's just a little exchange. The soldier goes to see his commander, and there's just this one line that says that, oh, you have it's a mental monologue to the commander, like, you have the freedom to send me to die in a split second, but I have the freedom to not having to deal with that decision.
Yeah. so you make one choice, and that's not to choose. I'll just let it go.
Speaking of single lines, I put this in the comments, but I'm reading C.S. Lewis's science fiction work, Paralandra, and I won't get deep into it. It's amazing, even if you're not a Christian or don't share Lewis's worldview, but the premise is that a human is sent to Venus, where he sort of oversees a reenactment of the temptation of Adam and Eve. So there's a man and a woman on Venus that are inhabitants there, but they haven't sinned, they haven't disobeyed. And in one conversation, the human is talking with the woman and realize she has no conception of the will. She thinks that she's just walking predefined paths, and he sort of opens her eyes to it. And she says, she sees that she makes her own choices. This is the first time this has happened to an inhabitant of the world. And she says, it is a delight with terror in it to see, like you said, Anna, you can just leave London. You're in control of that, and it can solve your problems. But the flip side of that is later on, the human that is sent there realizes that if the temptation is to be stopped, he's the one to do it, and he's going to have to do it with violence. And that's the terror, right? Like, it's not just freedom, it's that you may be called upon to make a great sacrifice, and if you don't, it won't be made, and that actually affects outcomes, and that's the terror. Yeah,
freedom is costly, right? So it's making choices, because it's you've alluded to that too tonight. That whole sort of fear of future regret is, I think, one of the big things. And I think for a lot of people, again, I worked a lot of work in the corporate space, a lot of business leaders who have half vested interests in their decisions, but they also kind of don't. Like, the consequences of failure then becomes sort of paralyzing in terms of choice. But it's also the case of, if you don't actively make a choice between option A or B, whether that's politics, economics, or personal life, if the choice that is made for you by whoever you secede your agency to, whether that's a boss or a politician or an economist or a financial advisor, makes the wrong choice, you have someone to blame. It's only when you proactively make a choice and draw up your list like little Darwin did, or ask your magic 8 ball, or sit in the dark and cry as to whether or not you should get married or get divorced or have a kid or not. If you don't proactively make those choices and you just accidentally get pregnant, right? It's someone else's fault. It's not yours.
Did you just call him Little Darwin?
I don't know. I don't always think.
Did she say Little Darwin?
I might have.
One of the greatest minds of human history, through that pro-con list that we've somehow stumbled on. He's just getting so diminished. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that he said that spending time with his wife would be better than a dog anyway. That's his lowest moment. And now he's just Little Darwin, little Chucky Darwin.
Well, he is. He's just a person at the end of the day. I'm not totally embarrassed.
Puts his pants on one leg at a time. There's a line in in Hebrew, and there's an English version too, that the Hebrew line is Ein Navi bimkomo. There's no prophet in his place. No one's a prophet in their hometown, because him when he was the kid who was, hanging around the street corners, and, sure, he can talk to God now, but I knew when he was just a little punk and needed to blow his nose more often. And now little Chucky Darwin, it's tough. I think his legacy is
I have a healthy disrespect for all of us as human beings.
feet of clay.
We still haven't heard from everyone here. Like other John.
We have lurkers.
We know you have things to say because you're putting in the comments, but we're running out of time. We're getting towards the end of our 2 hours, and we don't want you to have the regrets of not using your agency to make the choice to say a question.
Anybody here has a big pending decision? Anybody
the
here
option
has a
up.
big pending decision in your lives? Where you're either drawing up the pros cons list, or trying to just listen to your intuition right now, that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, please don't feel pressured to ask anything. That's not the point. It's just that if you have to feel encouraged that it's a safe space if you do want to get out there and ask Russ any questions. I do have one question for you if no one else does, and that is, you've written a book about making big life decisions and all the rest of it. Has it got easier? I mean, have you got it figured out? As you pointed out, you are probably a little bit older than us. So haven't asked anyone's ages. That's you made that observation yourself, so I'm comfortable.
Yeah, I think it's safe. I do write in the book about the decision to become president of Shalom College, move to Israel. I did realize, and I made that decision while I was writing the book, so I did realize that I was kind of holding my own feet to the fire and trying to use some of the ideas that I had in the book for making that decision. But of course, that was a joint decision with my wife. I didn't, I mentioned that in the book, but a lot of our decisions are shared, which does make it more complicated. But I found interesting for me personally is that as president of a college, I make decisions now all the time. And as a academic writer and researcher and essayist in the past, I basically made no decisions. My decision was should I have the tuna in oil or the tuna in water for lunch today? And I have found that from the practice of being in a position of leadership, which I'd never been in anything quite like it before, I've gotten a little bit better at making decisions. I don't find myself as anxious. I used to be, when I met, this is serious. When I was a plain academic, one of the hardest decisions I would often make is travel arrangements. Should I leave on Tuesday on the night flight or Wednesday in the morning? And I agonize over it. Those don't bother me at all. I don't even think about it for a second. My wife will say, should we do? I said, you decide, I don't care. So I do think that the practice of making decisions gets you more comfortable with living with uncertainty. And you are forced, when you're in a position of a little bit of authority, which I have a little bit of authority here, you're forced to make decisions and do less of the sit back and let things happen and have the status quo dominate. And it's a little bit dangerous, probably. You can, I think, mislead yourself about how good you are making decisions. But I do find myself agonizing less than I did a year ago before I took this job. Sort of interesting.
It was interesting that you said you made that choice while you were writing the book, because that wasn't clear from reading it, but that makes it all the more profound, right? When you're actually grappling with your own thoughts. But listening to what you said there, that making small decisions empowers you to make slightly bigger ones, and you kind of get into the pattern of doing these things. What is your thought there on general modernity and the fact that we're using technology right now to reduce our cognitive bandwidth overload by essentially taking away the small choices in our life. So the more and more of us, we're not making day-to-day choices, even as to what groceries we buy, what we're having for dinner. We'll subscribe if we're affluent enough to like a food, like in a box kind of a service. And we're outsourcing these decisions, deliberately ceding that agency to some sort of algorithm, whether it's a dating app, whether it's a set of food delivery app, or whether it's, you know, what we're going to read. We'll let whatever is curated in our feeds sort of do that. We wanted to choose which newspaper to pick up. We'll just see whatever the algorithmic gods deliver to us to consume for both food and knowledge in a given day. Is that perhaps something that we're going to come to regret when we stop that our deliberate pursuit of reducing the number of choices we make in a day is actually going to perhaps make our lives more difficult in the future, or not?
Well, I do think the nanny state takes away a lot of our adulthood.
Yeah, I mean, I use small examples. You're using much more sensible.
I don't like the idea. I mean, I wrote about this a long time ago. You know, the first time I was in Chile, it was 1981 or so, and I was 27 years old, and I didn't feel very well, and I went into the pharmacy to get some medicine, and it suddenly dawned on me that they don't have an FDA, and that in America, basically, you can take anything, you can buy anything off the shelf and nothing bad's going to happen. Not much good's going to happen, but the bad part's mainly been weeded out by excessive worrying about side effects. Whereas in other countries, you know, you're kind of on your own. Yeah, maybe you got to be a little more careful. They're selling some stuff maybe a little more powerful than you can get in the United States. And so that's, a lot of us like that. I get it, right? We like the idea that, I don't have to worry about that. That risk is gone. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with getting rid of risk. I don't want to romanticize risk as a fact of life. We're very fortunate that most of us live in safe places with limited risk. It's really a delight and a wonderful thing. But I do think your point about algorithms is relevant. I write about it a little bit in the book. These algorithms are great. I don't have to worry about that or think about it. It's fantastic. And yet we have lost a little bit. I don't want to over romanticize this, which is the flip side. We've lost serendipity is really a beautiful thing, right? It's fun to graze in a bookstore. It's fun to just sort of see what grabs your eye and open a book and try it. And we can do that a little bit with Kindle, even with the digital version. But the idea of, it's Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes about this a lot as the virtue of being a flaneur, a person who strolls, who walks around uncertain about what they're going to end up doing or where they're headed. And I write about in my book too, right? I write about that kind of tourism that, some people like to have an explicit plan for where they're going to go every minute of a vacation. And others like to be a flaneur. They like to walk and explore and see what catches their fancy and discover the undiscovered, the unexpected. So obviously in life, there's both are nice. So I don't think we want to do just one or the other.
Alexander.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just I want to respond to Anna's comment about feeling the nanny state of the EU. Something I noticed moving to the EU from South Africa was that it was such a shock to be in somewhere where the rules were really enforced, because in South Africa, anything's permissible if you can get away with it to a large degree. And it was really a shock. But I originally raised my hand for another point. Russ mentioned the nanny state kind of taking away our decisions. And one thing I'm really struck by is it feels like my generation, I guess a millennial, people are clamoring for more of that, not less.
Yeah.
Really struggle to understand where it comes from.
Blame when things go wrong, especially if you're being told for your whole life that things are going to go badly wrong. You don't want to be the one responsible for that, do you? I think that's part of it.
I always think of it, it's a deep question. I always think of it as this tension that we have as human beings when we come out of the womb. One of the things that we feel strongly is mine. And as infants, that's really powerful. Mine, me. I'm not you. I'm me. And I get what I want, and I want more of that, and I'm going to grab it. If you give me that, I'm going to throw it. And as infants, we're always pushing our autonomy. At the same time, we kind of yearn for the womb, that comfort, that snuggling and being taken care of and not having to worry about making mistakes and having other people to blame. So I think there's always this tension. We've emphasized autonomy tonight, but there's also a desire to give up responsibility and to return to the womb, to return to the safety of other people making decisions for us. Adam Smith writes about it very beautifully. I didn't write about this much in my book, but he writes very powerfully about our desire to look up to a monarch, a leader, an authoritarian, a king. And I've been thinking about this a lot in the wake of the death of Queen Elizabeth and the emotional response that people have had that's a little bit hard to understand because she's not much of a queen, right? She's like a shadow queen, a platonic shadow of a queen.
Not power.
What?
No power there.
What?
A figurehead, a symbol.
Yeah, she's a symbolic queen, and yet there are echoes of a real queen for us, for some people who want to have someone to look up to and to have some control over us, and who will take care of us, who will look out for us, who will relieve me of the responsibility of adulthood. The Smith has more to say about it that's quite interesting psychologically, that we have a love of powerful people because we see their lives as a fairy tale, a narrative that we can embrace, and we root for them even when they're horrible. Queen was a pretty nice person, more or less. I mean, I'm sure she had some personal issues, as we all do. She's just a human being, but she's not doesn't appear to be a wicked person, as far as we can tell. So, and yet people love Stalin. They were sad when he died. He's a wicked person. He was not even, there's no doubt about it. And I think they knew enough about him to know that. And yet the Russian people mourned him.
The leader.
Yeah, he was the leader. It's a human impulse.
That's almost Girardian, but that's going to derail this conversation. And with the time we have left, Jonathan, you have raised your hand. Please go for it. And then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, what I really like, I love that question that you asked around like outsourcing your brain. And there is a concept that leading on from interoception, like the extended mind, like your mind isn't your mind, our body, and everything we talk about, like outsourcing that. And the idea that there is, if you outsource it, you can't get it back, but you can choose to take it back. So you can trust the algorithms to send you the meals that you want every week, but you can also take it back. It's the decisions that you want to make of like, hey, do I want to care about like what meals I eat, or do I want to focus my attention on this thing or that thing? And
which apps you want to run at the same time.
Sorry?
Which apps you want to run and which ones you can sort of put into storage.
Yeah, exactly. And this is my thing anyway. I love talking about this as a point of like, in business, we're all told to do different things that we have to do and should do. And actually we don't have to do them. And it starts from the way that we want to work and making the decisions that we want to make and then letting someone else do it. My brain never stops thinking. I am very happy to let a meal prep service prep my meals for me to make sure I get that. But if I don't want to eat those meals, I won't eat them. I'll go make something instead. And so it's like, even if for me, I don't see it as giving it up. It's just giving us an option, and then we can take it back as and when we want. So I was like, that's super. Just love the idea that we still have control at the end of the day to choose and decide what we want to do, even if we use the tools around us to extend what we're thinking about or how we think or where we focus. It's just it's an option versus a finite thing, just like we were talking about how you can travel and go somewhere and then you can always come back. We're now in the society we're in. We can make these decisions and then go, yeah, no, that didn't work for me. I'm going to go back to what I had before because that actually fits me in that experimentation of like looking at what we have and like what we are happy to accept, and looking at ourselves in the mirror every day is like what matters to us and the decisions that we want to make. And
That's great. I just want to add one thing. The flip side of this that it deserves to be said, and it's consistent with what Jonathan just said. It's Alfred North Whitehead's quote: "Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them." And he's onto something there, right? There's so many things in life that our predecessors had to agonize over and worry about and try to figure out. And, we don't have to haul water up from the river to cook or to bathe, and most of us, mercifully. And even though I defended earlier the idea that making decisions helps you get better at making them, something to be said for outsourcing those decisions that are not so important to algorithms and apps and other things than saving your brain power and anxiety for things that are more important. So
choosing what to decide. There's like a fine line there, right? So it's one thing to choose not to waste your time on making irrelevant decisions that actually have no sort of material consequence on your future flourishing or your present happiness. But there's also the other sort of line there where you get to the point where you stop getting into the habits of making any choices for yourself, right? So it's kind of choosing where the line is. They're both valid ways to look at the points that have been covered today. Worth thinking about. We've got a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground, probably gone a little bit wide ranging, but I want to thank everyone for their time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Russ, for writing an interesting book that's definitely kept us talking. We don't have much dead air time there. It didn't make our jobs very difficult at all. And if you want to continue the conversation, maybe you can just tell them where, I've got a fly here, where they can find you. If you do want to do that, if you've got a Twitter handle or a website, I think it's always nice to continue these conversations in a different format. We've got all these channels.
As we said earlier, my podcast is Econ Talk. My Twitter handle is Econ Talker, an ER at the end of Econ Talk. And you can find all my writing and speeches and anything, way too much. The videos I've done, my rap videos, my animated poem, you can find those all at russroberts.info. And I want to thank all the participants. It was a fascinating conversation, and I very, very much enjoyed it. And Bronwyn and Anna, thank you for pushing this and driving it forward. Great time.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to the next book.
Thank you so much, Russ.
Thank you, Russ.
Pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Russ.
Bye.
Thank you, Russ.
Bye-bye.